So we're now moving on to our second keynote of the conference from Ignacio Silva. Ignacio holds a DPhil in theology and an MSc in science and religion from the University of Oxford, and he also has a licence degree in philosophy from the Catholic University of Argentina. He was previously a research fellow at Harris Manchester College and the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion, with projects on special divine action, science, philosophy and theology, and science and philosophy and theology in Latin America. And he currently does research on human and divine providence. He's also a member of the International Society for Science and Religion and member of the scientific and advisory boards for a number of academic journals. And I'm not going to try and crucify them in Spanish. So on that note, as with Emily's paper, we've got 75 minutes. So looking at up to an hour, Ignacio, for your presentation, and the rest of the time for Q&A. As before, folks, if you do have questions for Ignacio during his presentation, please do pop them in the chat as they appear, and we can then filter them through. With that, I will hand over to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much, Finn, for this invitation. Thank you for the To Science and Religion Forum. It's always a great joy to be around, even if virtually at this time. And greetings from a very, very warm morning in Argentina, here in the Southern Hemisphere. It's always great to speak about these things. And it was fantastic to hear Scott's and Emily's presentations, because they paved the ground for this talk. So I hope you enjoy it, and bear with me, and we'll just go into it. So Arthur Peacocke was certainly compelled, as many were in his time, and many of us are still today, to offer a coherent theological discourse about God's providential action in the world. Peacocke suggested that God's action should not be conceived as an intervention, even if that intervention was to be thought of within the indeterministic character of quantum mechanics, as Robert Russell or John Polkinghorne would suggest. I shall go into Peacocke's critiques of these two proposals later. Instead, Peacocke held to a non-energetic, non-material transfer of information at the boundaries of the world as a whole. In this way, God could influence the development of the history of creation as a whole, and of humanity in particular. My goal today will be to assess this proposal against some criteria or desiderata that I find in the history of debates about divine providential action from the Middle Ages to the 20th and 21st century. These criteria will be divine omnipotence, divine providence, the autonomy of nature, and the success of human natural reason. The problems about the question on providential divine action in the world arise almost spontaneously for anyone who briefly considers it, since it would seem that were God to intervene in nature, acting within it according to divine intentions, he would be breaking, suspending, or simply not adhering to the apparent order of the created universe. For many, this would imply an incongruity in the very nature of God. Furthermore, the notion of a God acting directly in nature appears to challenge the autonomy of nature, and thus the foundational principles of the natural sciences. Nevertheless, many contemporary Christian thinkers find it necessary to provide models and explanations for how it is possible to understand that nature possesses its own order and regular actions, while also affirming the theological claim that God can actively and providentially participate in the development of the natural and human world. Ultimately, the God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is not a marginal figure. He is a God who engages with his creation. As a prelude to evaluating contemporary models of divine action, it would be beneficial, I think, to identify certain criteria that can help assess these models. Hence, my suggestion to explore history, to seek for these criteria by analyzing models proposed in past theological debates regarding divine providential action, looking for ideals that guided these discussions. These ideas will be what I call desiderata, that is, propositions that any model of divine action aspires to affirm to a certain extent. Now, my exploration will consist of a brief metaphysical history of various models of divine providential action, beginning with medieval Arabic discussions, continuing through medieval Christian thought and early modernity, and culminating in the proposals of 19th and 20th century that shape our current debates. My argument will be that Thomas Aquinas, for instance, in the 13th century, addressed problems analogous to those tackled by Al-Ghazali or even Rushd Averroes before him, as Scott was saying, sharing similar assumptions with debates that emerged during the 17th and late 19th centuries. Now, even if the 13th and 17th century debates were framed in different philosophical terms, for example, lacking mentions of quantum theories, chaos, or the Big Bang as we do today, my argument is that there are consistent philosophical and theological assumptions throughout history to explain divine providential action in the universe. This historical outline will thus allow me to extract 4 desiderata for evaluating the debate. This is not working for some reason. So the omnipotence of God, as I was saying, God's participation in the workings of nature, that is divine providence, the autonomy of nature, and the success of natural reason and science. I prefer not to elaborate on how to understand these criteria too deeply at this point, as they will become evident during my exploration. However, it is worth noting that it would be unwise to attempt a strict definition of these, as although they have all played important roles in discussions of providence and divine action, they have also evolved in how they were understood while maintaining a common core. Ultimately, my argument will assert that regardless of how historical figures have understood these principles, they have always had to grapple with them in their models of divine providential action. I will begin with an analysis of debates in the medieval Arab and Christian worlds, presenting the thoughts of scholars like Al-Ghazali, Ibn Rushd, Aquinas, Ibn Gabirol, perhaps. These debates questioned whether Aristotle's philosophical ideas were suitable for explaining the nature of the relationship between the divine and the created world. I will then move to early modernity to demonstrate how models of divine providential action from this period required understanding that the decline of medieval Aristotelian thought led to a new ways of conceiving how God interacted with a created universe through the laws of nature, an idea which was foreign to medieval thinkers, the laws of nature. Finally, I will analyze how discussions from late 19th century and early 20th century about whether the universe behaved deterministically or indeterministically shaped theological conceptions of how God would or would not act providentially. The metaphysics of providence has a rich history, beginning with Persian scholars such as Al-Ghazali. In his influential work, The Incoherence of the Philosophers, Al-Ghazali critiqued Greek-influenced philosophers, particularly Ibn Sina, Avicenna, for their inability to create a coherent model of providential divine action. Al-Ghazali was a key figure among the Mutakallimun, that is, Islamic theologians who emphasized Kalam theology, which posits that God's omnipotence implies that there are no inherent active powers in nature. Rather, every event is a direct act of God, a view that was later known as occasionalism. From the 8th to the 12th centuries, Kalam theologians argued that the universe was created ex nihilo, from nothing, and that it is continuously recreated by God at every instant. It seems as Scots and I gathered together beforehand, right? This continuous creation, we have not. This continuous creation allowed for a rational understanding of the universe, justified by God's immutable will, while maintaining the regularities we now recognize as the laws of nature. Kalam theologians believe that entities do not possess intrinsic powers for change. Instead, any change is dependent only on God's direct intervention. This view diminished the role of natural causality, positioning God as the sole active agent in the world, thus maintaining divine sovereignty. Contrasting to this perspective, philosophers like Ibn Rushd Averroes maintained that nature operates autonomously. He rejected the concept of creatio ex nihilo, arguing that if anything came out of nothing, then the coherence between causes and effects would be lost, making knowledge of the natural world impossible. He contended that acknowledging natural causes is essential for understanding both the universe and the divine, arguing that if nature had no causal powers, one could not comprehend God's existence or actions at all. This philosophical discourse crossed into medieval Europe, influencing thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. Through the works of Maimonides and translations of Averroes, Aquinas engaged with the views of the Kalam, critiquing their interpretation of causality. He argued that Kalam theologians misunderstood first and secondary causality, primary and secondary causality, asserting that denying natural causality contradicts sensory experience, rationality, and the divine goodness. For Aquinas, created things possess genuine causal powers granted by God, who acts as the primary cause, allowing them to act and contribute to the unfolding of the universe. Ultimately, Aquinas argued for a vision of divine action that does not suppress the efficacy of created things, but rather operates alongside it. He maintained that God's continual involvement in the world is compatible with the natural powers of created beings, providing a more integrated understanding of divine providence and action in nature. This exploratory outline is simply a brief overview of the medieval arguments that begin to reveal these desiderata, the causal powers of God versus natural causal powers, and the success of human inquiry into nature. The main points of the arguments explained so far are similar to those in contemporary debates. Since it seems that we discovered causes in nature, there appears to be two possible paths to follow. Either we accept that nature has its own rules, which cannot be broken, rejecting any action external to nature, or we find that natural things do not have actions, allowing only God to act directly within the created universe. Moving onwards, this historical exploration, we find that the 16th and 17th centuries marked the emergence of the scientific method, developed by figures such as Francis Bacon, Galileo, or René Descartes. These thinkers pioneered experimental and mathematical approaches in science, introducing mechanical models to explain natural phenomena, which led to a significant departure from the Aristotelian worldview that had dominated earlier thought. This shift allowed for a new understanding of God's providential role in creation, moving away from Aquinas' Aristotelian concept of four causes that had been prevalent in medieval philosophy. Now, Descartes initiated the reduction of formal and final causes to efficient causes, reflecting a mechanical philosophy that prioritized efficient causality. Leibniz and Kant further equated the term cause with force, suggesting that all physical phenomena could be understood through the lens of forces, thereby sidelining Aristotelian categories. This mechanistic view gradually replaced the late medieval idea of hidden qualities in nature, leading to a historical rejection of the Aristotelian methods. In this new framework of natural philosophy, atoms, considered the smallest invisible units of matter, were described as lacking inherent powers, possessing only motion within a vacuum. The behavior of these atoms could be explained with mathematical propositions labeled as the laws of nature, with Descartes asserting that such laws were established by God, the ultimate legislator, and imposed onto the created universe. The acceptance of these laws of nature implied a divine legislator, thus reinstating God's sovereignty in a world perceived to be overly autonomous under Aristotelian thought. Medieval scholars like Thomas Aquinas argued for God's involvement in natural processes through secondary causes. This perspective, for many in early modernity, seemed to limit divine agency, as it suggested that nature had its own causal powers. For 17th century natural philosophers, the more causal powers attributed to nature, the less authority God had over it, the less dominion. In contrast, the new mechanical and atomic philosophy allowed for a vision of nature devoid of inherent causal powers, thus reinstating God's dominion. Samuel Clarke, a theologian influenced by Newton, emphasized that the course of nature reflects God's arbitrary will, while Descartes expressed confidence in his mechanical philosophy, claiming it reinforced faith rather than undermined it. He asserted that traditional Aristotelian philosophy would have been rejected as incompatible with the Christian faith if his ideas had been recognized earlier. The acceptance of this new mechanical view spread across Europe, leading to the emergence of doctrines like occasionalism, notably supported by philosophers such as Nicolas Malebranche. As in the Islamic episode, occasionalism highlighted God's active involvement in every natural event, contrasting sharply with the previous philosophical stance that allowed nature its own causal powers. In the late 17th century, this perspective gained traction among Descartes followers and influential thinkers of the time like Locke, Boyle, Leibniz, and Hume. This shift represented a significant transformation in how philosophers understood the relationship between divine and natural causality. By adopting an atomic and mechanical philosophy, early modern thinkers could argue that the natural world should lack its own causal powers, enabling a clearer view of God's sovereignty. This new perspective allowed for discoveries about the workings of nature, reinforcing the belief in a divine creator, in his will and his power. The relationship between divine and natural causality became a focal point of philosophical discourse, reflecting similar debates from the medieval period. In the 20th century, discussions continued around whether the universe operated deterministically or indeterministically, echoing earlier tensions between natural and divine causality. The evolving understanding of these concepts demonstrates the enduring significance of the philosophical inquiries initiated during the scientific revolution, revealing a continuous exploration of the relationship between the divine and the natural world. Overall, the transition from Aristotelian to mechanical and atomic philosophies not only reshaped scientific inquiry, but also redefined theological perspectives, reestablishing God's authority in a world increasingly understood through mathematical and mechanistic frameworks. This philosophical evolution paved the way for modern debates in science and theology, highlighting the complex interplay between divine providence and the natural order. Although the growth of experimental science in the 17th century was notable, the experimental basis for atomism remained weak, lacking direct support from scientific experiments. Thus, the idea of divine governance over atoms through natural laws offered a foundational element for this particular view of nature. However, this perspective shifted dramatically during the 18th and 19th century, particularly with the introduction of Dalton's chemical atomism, which provided a robust link between atomic theory and scientific experimentation. This understanding laid the groundwork for a fully developed experimental concept of matter in the 19th century, and combined with a mechanistic view of nature, led philosophers and scientists to consider causality in purely deterministic terms. Numerous examples of this deterministic outlook can be found in the writings of 19th century scientists. Claude Bernard believed that there is absolute determinism in all sciences, asserting that the conditions for all phenomena in the living and non-living world are strictly determined. In the same vein, Henri Poincaré contended that science is inherently deterministic, claiming, and I quote here, "Science postulates determinism because without it, it could not exist." In a definitive statement reminiscent of Laplace, he affirmed that we are absolute determinists. And I quote, "Every phenomenon, no matter how small, has a cause," he claimed. Edmund Goblot, in the early 20th century, reinforced this perspective by stating that science does not allow for the possibility of contingency. He argued, quote, "Without determinism, there is no science," emphasizing that belief in determinism is essential for scientists. Now, the deterministic view of nature was championed by Pierre-Simon Laplace early in the 19th century, who expressed in his Essai philosophique sur la probabilité that, and I quote, "we must conceive the current state of the universe as the effect of its previous state and as the cause of that which follows." He asserted that a sufficiently powerful intelligence could analyze all natural forces and the arrangement of matter, predicting all future events. Laplace concluded that this deterministic framework is evident and requires no proof. The universality of this determinism rested on the principle of sufficient reason. Everything that comes to be must have a preceding cause. Consequently, the current state of the universe is both an effect of its prior state and a cause of its future state. This worldview guided scientists in their inquiries throughout the 18th, 19th, and much of the 20th century, informing discussions of divine providence in the previous century. Goblot's idea that without determinism there would be no science was echoed by Lord Kelvin, who asserted that the deterministic worldview implied a mechanical perspective of the world. In his 1904 Baltimore Lectures on Molecular Dynamics and the Wave Theory of Light, Kelvin remarked, and I quote, "I am never satisfied until I can make a mechanical model of a thing. If I can make a mechanical model, I can understand it." This mechanical determinism framed the universe in geometric terms, emphasizing the invariability of the laws of nature, their consistency and necessity, while sidelining qualitative variety and the intrinsic contingency of the experiential world. Instances of contingent causation were reduced to mere epistemological indeterminism, which could be traced back to an underlying rigorous and absolute determinism. Within this context, some argued that since the universe behaved deterministically, God could not act within it after his creation from nothing. As Rudolf Bultmann said in the 1960s, when worldly events are seen as a closed series, there is certainly no room for any act of God. Bultmann is ultimately asserting that divine action can be considered as a causal link between natural causes, because there is no space for such a link. Reflecting on this statement, Simon Kopf has recently noted that the natural world is, for Bultmann, a self-sufficient unit, immune to the interference of supernatural powers, leaving no space for divine action in worldly events. By 1965, Frank Dealey challenged contemporary theologians by asserting if one is going to speak of a God who acts, one must be prepared to offer some description of the mechanics of divine action, insisting that it is necessary to demonstrate in science itself how God acts. Closer to us, Robert Russell from the Center for Theology and the Natural Sciences in Berkeley expressed a similar viewpoint, positing that any special divine action within a Newtonian deterministic worldview was almost entirely precluded. If the physical world is a causally classed deterministic system, then any action by a free divine agent would require a violation of natural processes. However, Russell also pointed out that there were unexpected theoretical challenges that emerged within this deterministic world when Max Planck introduced the foundations of quantum physics, a development later recognized as one of the most significant advancements in human thought. The introduction of Planck's quantum of action paved the way for interpreting physical reality in indeterministic terms, as quantum systems do not evolve deterministically at every moment. Events such as the wave function collapse illustrate instances that defy the strict determinism foundational to 19th century science, which had constrained theologians' ability to discuss God's participation in worldly affairs. This new perspective seemed to provide theologians and philosophers of religion the opportunity to re-establish the notion of God's providential action within creation. Russell, for instance, proposed that God could operate within the causal openness of quantum indeterminism, as Emily told us a while ago, or any scientific theory that presents some form of ontological causal indeterminism. For Russell, nature's causality is insufficient to realize certain distinct outcomes, and it is within this insufficiency where Russell sees God acting, complementing nature to produce the collapse of a quantum system. In Russell's own words, if the world is indeterministic, God's special objective action is non-interventionist when it brings about events which go beyond those described by the laws of nature, without contravening or disproving them, because natural efficient causality as described by these laws is created by God ex nihilo to be insufficient to bring these particular events about. John Polkinghorne suggested that chaos theory could offer a more promising avenue for modeling God's providential action in the world. Polkinghorne's proposal modeled God's action as the divine input of active information in chaotic systems, for which he assumed an indeterministic interpretation of chaos theory. The notion of active information is brought about by the need to postulate some new top-down organizing causal principles to complement energetic causality, since regardless of the path that the chaotic system follows, the energy remains the same. These organizing causal principles act by the input of active information and operate holistically over the whole system. Polkinghorne explains that active information brings about the formation of a structure of or pattern of future dynamical behavior. Thus, active is used to describe its causal efficacy, and information to describe the pattern-forming behavior. For Polkinghorne, then, the key notion of information input explains what actually occurs, concluding that there should be a flow of active information from God to the universe, by which God guides it providentially. The end of the deterministic era in science created an opportunity for theologians to articulate God's providential activity within nature. However, this opportunity emerged because divine causality was perceived as opposed to natural causality. An event's determination had to arise from either God's power or the power of nature. This reflects the perspective held by Bultmann, Dilly, Russell, and Polkinghorne, reiterating the ongoing need to choose between these two forms of causality. Ultimately, as Dilly suggested, the implications of the deterministic stance indicate that the integrity of science may be at stake if one needs to maintain a model of God's active participation in the world. As I indicated earlier, I undertook this brief historical narration to unearth some constants or metaphysical principles that I believe guide the debates that have occurred throughout history regarding divine providential action. These constants function as metaphysical options that theologians and philosophers had to choose from in order to make sense of their intuitions on the matter. As I hope it has become somewhat clear, almost all debates surrounding these topics, so the Arabic medieval Islam, Christianity, medieval times, I only mentioned Aquinas, but there are many others, 17th century turn to mechanical atomistic philosophy, and 19th and early 20th century debates on deterministic and indeterministic universe. Yeah. So all these debates have attempted to accept as many as at least 4 metaphysical constants or desiderata, which are always at play. Ultimately, each position in the episodes I described opted for one or more of these desiderata. The omnipotence of God, understood broadly as God having the power to bring about any non-contradictory state of affairs. The providential action of God in the created universe, meaning that God not only creates and sustains the universe, but also that he acts objectively and directly in nature to guide it towards the end he has decided. The autonomy of nature in its activity, that is the idea that there is no reason to assume that nature requires something extra natural to act in an orderly and regular manner. And finally, the success of natural reason and science, meaning that reason and science, broadly understood as an empirical study of nature, have legitimate access to the created nature and its activities, and can describe them in a rational and naturalistic way, without resorting to extra-natural explanations. Divine omnipotence was preferred over natural causal powers by some medieval Islamic thinkers and by occasionalists in the 16th and 17th centuries. They understood that affirming the causal powers of nature would diminish God's power, a theological assertion they found unsustainable. Conversely, the autonomy of nature was affirmed in opposition to God's power in the ideas of Averroes, and in the 13th century debate, God could not act where natural causes are at work. In other words, if God were to act, there could not be other causes operating. The denial of the intrinsic natural causal powers during the 17th century, due to the adoption of atomism and the rejection of Aristotelian forms, led to the acceptance of God's direct and continuous action in the universe, which, perhaps counterintuitively, reinforced the success of mechanical natural philosophy. The theological situation of the 20th century presents the opposite side of the story, assuming that the success of the natural sciences meant that God's providential action in nature must be denied. The key question in these debates was either to affirm God's omnipotence and providence while denying the causal powers of nature, or conversely, to affirm the natural causal powers, thereby diminishing God's power and maintaining the success of reason in the study of nature. William Carroll explained this situation as follows, and I quote, "The fear is that any causality one attributes to God must consequently be denied to creatures. The central issue is what one is willing to relinquish and what one wishes to hold on to. As I have attempted to demonstrate, however, there are no essential pairs. One can hold on to the principles of God's omnipotence and providence alongside the success of natural sciences, as was the case during the mechanistic natural philosophy of early modernity. Or one can assume the success of the natural sciences while rejecting God's providential action in the world, thus calling into question God's omnipotence, as was in the case with some 20th century theologians. Thomas Aquinas, for his part, attempted at holding the four desiderata simultaneously, affirming God's radical omnipotence implicit in his doctrine of creation ex nihilo. This led him to assert, through his distinction between primary and secondary causality, that natural causes are real causes that one can know through the light of human reason, whether through the methods of Aquinas' natural philosophy, those of 17th century natural philosophers, or those of contemporary natural sciences. Although there are some Thomists who are not so sure about that, but we can discuss that later. Those are details, intra-school details. We arrive now at the key issue of this presentation, which is whether Arthur Peacocke's model of providential divine action holds to these criteria, or to which it holds. First, it might be useful to see why he rejects both Robert Russell's and John Polkinghorne's models, so we can get a better grasp of Peacocke's own intuitions. Arthur Peacocke rejects both Russell's quantum divine action and Polkinghorne's chaos divine theory, divine action. With regards to Russell's, although Peacocke claims that it appears as a particularly attractive proposal, he rejects it because of the many difficulties to be solved to get a full account of it. Amongst these, Peacocke mentions the problem of the ontological status of the laws of nature, God's knowledge of future contingent events, and the problems of the interpretation of the theory. The very basis of his rejection is that he interprets quantum divine action as a proposal which does not reach its own goal and ends up affirming an interventionist type of divine action, which is what Russell wanted to avoid. He also rejects John Polkinghorne's chaos divine action, basically because he does not agree with Polkinghorne's interpretation of chaos theory as an indeterministic theory. Peacocke is convinced that the unpredictability of the theory does not allow us, as Polkinghorne believes, to regard it as an indeterministic theory, and hence does not open any causal window for God to act in it. God, for Peacocke, could act at the initial conditions of a chaotic system, altering them in such a way that we would not be able to notice the change, given the impossibility of human knowledge of these initial conditions, and hence changing the future of the system without our noticing the cause of the change. This act, however, would also be an interventionist way of describing God's action in the world, given that the equations of chaos theory are as deterministic as Newton's equations. The only point in favor of this proposal for Peacocke is that this intervention would be always hidden from human research, but it would still be an intervention, which both Russell and Polkinghorne were striving to avoid. In his own words, Peacocke has no need for this hypothesis. He then characterizes his views on how God interacts with the world, saying that it is a holistic, top-down, continuing process of information input, conceived of broadly, whereby God's intention and purpose are implemented in the shaping of particular events or patterns of events, without any abrogation in the regularities discerned by the sciences in the natural order. This conception of divine action is highly dependent on Peacocke's own notions of God and the universe. It is his idea, as well as that of many others, that the universe must be regarded as a system of systems, in which all the interior systems are interconnected and interdependent across space and time. Hence, these systems will influence each other at different levels, and the system of systems will equally influence all the systems of which it is composed. This is what is known as whole-part causation. Real features of a system as a whole influence what happens to the constituents of that system. These constituents behave as they do because they are part of this particular system. To this perspective on the universe, Peacocke adds the idea of God's being immanently present to all of this system of systems, as being that which constitutes the circumambient reality of all which exists. This means, in Peacocke's words, that God's being is distinct from created beings, although created beings may be regarded as being in God. Hence, somehow God is the boundary of the systems of systems, boundary that should not be understood as a physical boundary, but more as God's being the boundary of existing beings regarding their actual existence. Then it is not that God is somehow outside the universe, or that God is what is beyond the universe in a spatial sense. This relation should rather be understood as created things being surrounded by God's being. And in this sense, it is that things are in God. In accordance with this, if God is the existential boundary of the universe, and accepting that boundaries can have causal influence in the system they surround, then God can be regarded as influencing the universe as a totality. Hence, Peacocke argues, it could be said that God is able to exercise influence upon events in any sub-level of existence of which the universe is made, without acting to bring about events in the universe, without intervening within the supposed, without abrogating the laws and regularities that specifically apply to them. Even more, God would be acting to bring about events in the universe without intervening within the supposed gaps provided by any scientific theory, as in quantum divine action or chaos divine action. Peacocke then concludes by stating that particular events could occur in the world and be what they are because God intends them to be so, without any contravention of the laws of nature, studied by any of the natural sciences. This could be so simply because divine whole part influences operate for every individual of each constituent system of the world. God can then influence holistically each state of the universe, because the ontological gap that exists between the universe as such and God is simply everywhere in space and time, given that God's being somehow embraces completely the being of the universe and its constituents. There is then no need for a causal gap within nature for Peacocke, such as those presented in quantum mechanics, or to act. Peacocke further explains the actual way in which God's action influences the universe and a special event in it, suggesting that God would interact initially with the universe as a whole. From here, God's influence would cause a kind of chain of causes and effects along the hierarchy of systems, up to the point where this chain reaches the level that God intended to influence, and hence an event produced by God's influence will occur. This model provides a flexible path for the transmission of divinely influencing information within the world system as a whole, down to particular systems within that whole, Peacocke thinks. So he concludes, the place where God interacts with the universe on this model is not a part or parts of it, but the universe as a whole, which is in God's own being an analogous action to that of information flow without energy transfer. However, Peacocke warns us that, given the incommensurability of God, we could never fully describe and understand this action, and it can only be pointed at and described from our side of the boundary, something like Austin Farrer claimed about when talking about the causal joint. Although an interesting metaphysical path to follow, I believe, which is certainly different from that of Russell and Polkinghorne, Peacocke's model is also presented as dependent on the science of today. As it happens with the quantum divine action model, where the contemporary scientific theories were shown to be unsuccessful, as all the major theories in the history have been, theological models of providential divine action would have to change all over again. As Mariusz Tabajek, a Polish Dominican now working in Rome at the Angelicum, he has put it, I missed the H. Peacocke does not escape the tendency of treating God as a univocal cause that belongs to the same order of causation as natural causes. What becomes obvious in this context, Tabajek continues, is Peacocke's concern that God's action should not violate any laws and regularities applying to the various levels of the complexity. But one can violate only if they are of the same. One can violate another only if they are of the same sort. Only if univocal causes need to leave room lest they interfere with one another. This critique, and I finish with this, opens the door to assessing how Peacocke's model fares against the four criteria, or the desiderata, we found in our quick history of providential divine action. In the end, as one can expect after considering Tabachek's assessment, in order to recognize the value of contemporary natural science and the autonomy of nature, Peacocke's proposal opposes natural causality to divine causality, thus at least reducing divine omnipotence and providence. After all, one of the main features of Peacocke's model is that God only interacts with the universe as a whole, and not with parts of it. That is, even if God is intimate to every being, God is bound to interact with the universe as a whole in order to cause a change in a particular section of it, without being able to interact with each being to which he is intimate. This implies that the immanent creator God is bound to the very creation he created to act in a specific way and constrained to do so within certain limits. Ultimately, even if Peacocke was striving to avoid falling into the trap of interventionism, as he contended that Russell and Polkinghorne did, by suggesting a model in which God is bound by its own creation not to intervene in any way, he ends up agreeing with the fact that one must restrain, at least to a degree, God's omnipotence and providence to leave natural causality and the autonomy of the sciences intact. And thank you very much for listening.
Thanks, Ignacio. I think just well done on capturing so much of the history of the conversation
Thank you.
in such a short period of time. We've got one question in the chat, which I'll put out to you, and I'll then hopefully come to live questions. So Andrew asks, are Peacocke's divine boundaries tantamount to causal gaps without which creation would not achieve the result that God had intended? A gapless account would surely see God and creation as not in competition or interacting on the same ontological plane, which I think you were starting to get to at the end with that question around, are they acting at the same levels? It is in the chat if you want to read it through, and I don't know if Andrew wants to feed in at all if you need any clarification.
Yeah. Andrew, do you want to say anything before I start?
I think I wrote that before your very last slide. So
Excellent,
yeah.
excellent.
I think the word univocal or univocal, which Mariusz Tabachek mentioned, really is capturing what I'm talking about, the idea that God and creation are speaking with one voice, or operating in the same way. And that's where all these problems come in my opinion, with regard to divine action. So it's 50% God, 50% creation, or whatever, instead of 100% God, 100% creation. At least that's the Thomistic view.
Yeah, that's the Thomist view. So two things here. So I made this very quick history just to show that we're still talking about the same, and probably the future will look more or less about the same, with a few more elements into the discussion. But as well, I didn't want to make a like a value judgment. I just want to show that, particularly within this conference, I focused on Peacocke, which is someone that I kind of neglected in my previous writing, and I thought it was a very good opportunity to get into him again. That even if he wants to avoid interventionism as Russell and Polkinghorne, and I think he's right in that criticism. He's still working with this univocal type of understanding causality, God's causality and divine causality, and in that sense, he's bound to diminish or make omnipotence and providence retreat a little bit, if we can put it somehow. I think it is more promising than Russell and Polkinghorne, but again, and perhaps this is my Thomism coming from inside, it is not quite there. But that's just a way of putting it. Yeah.
Thanks, Ignacio. Brendan, and then I think Douglas briefly had a hand, and then Paul, I think. Oh no, Luca. So Brendan, Luca, and then Paul.
Okay, hi everybody, and thank you very much, Ignacio, for a great paper. Like you, I've been studying Peacocke recently, mostly concerned with chance and determinism and law, but I'm interested in your view, Ignacio, because you seem to have a really good grasp of his theology. I just cannot understand in what way God interacts with the universe on his view. There's a certain vagueness to it, and I can't see, like, is he saying that there is something in God's being that affects the causal activity in the world? Or is he saying that the causal activity takes place within God's being, and in that sense, God could be said to affecting it? I can't understand where the causal connection is on his view. There's a certain vagueness to it, and I was wondering, could you just comment maybe on that issue? Thank you.
Yeah. I'll make a little bit turn just to return to the question, because it's spot on, actually. And I'll start with John Polkinghorne here. John was very worried about what he called fideistic views of divine action. As a good physicist and following on Lord Kelvin, he wanted mechanisms, right? So he hated talk about double agency, particularly following the work of Austin Farrer, which I mentioned very, very briefly, because Farrer, with whom all these people studied, or at least who all these people studied, perhaps not with whom, but they all studied Farrer. For Farrer, the causal joint is vague. The causal joint is surrounded by a cloud of mist, and that's almost a quote. If my mind is not as great as Aquinas was, he could quote anything by memory. I cannot. But he's very specific, Farrer, in saying this. Yeah, the causal joint is surrounded by a cloud which we cannot penetrate. Right, and John Polkinghorne hated that. He didn't like that because he couldn't understand, right? And I think that's why he also didn't like Peacocke's proposal. And it's exactly what you are pointing at, Brendan. Speaking of existential boundaries and the boundary of being and the universe as a whole is really vague. It's difficult to conceptualize, right? So what Peacocke had in mind, I think, it's something like, I don't know if this will ring any bell. It's like the Parmenidean being, so being of Parmenides almost, but with an intrinsic dynamic, right? So we are within that. And that being, God, by acting, causes some causal chains within it. That's what Peacocke says. That doesn't mean that I understand it or I conceptualize it in a kind of an image in my mind, right? But again, I think you are spot on. It's somewhat vague as well to my reading, and it's something that it was a problem for that generation of thinkers, right? Arthur Peacocke, John Polkinghorne, Austin Farrer, a bit before. It was a problem, and they struggle with it, I think. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Luca.
Yeah, thank you, Ignacio. Very interesting presentation. You know, before when Emily was presenting, and this is related to your presentation, you mentioned, if I understood correctly, that Robert Russell could be interpreted in a way that is consonant with Thomistic theology. Did I understand correctly? Yeah? Okay, so
No. So he wants to.
He wants to make it.
But I mean, Michael Dotz was not convinced. I am not convinced.
Okay.
Mariusz Tabacek is not convinced.
Okay, that makes sense.
But Bob Russell tries to. Yeah.
Okay, I found so difficult to think that he would match the Thomistic. It's so different, so I couldn't. Yeah. And
well, I mean, he has a point, if I may, in the following, right? When you read Aquinas, he says that God's providence works within the contingent causes in the universe, right? Not, and this is the difference. So up to there, they agree, Aquinas and Russell. But then Russell would say, and God decides what is the result of that contingent cause, because it is insufficient, and God complements it. And Aquinas would say that because the goal, the end, the telos of that contingent cause is within God's providence. And so that's where they depart. But both recognize the importance of indeterministic and contingent events for providence. Yeah. I mean, in Peacocke's world, the system of systems could be just as deterministic as Laplace, and God would still work in the boundary, right? So Peacocke doesn't need determinism. He recognizes it, but doesn't need it. Yeah. Now, both Aquinas and Russell kind of require contingency.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Paul, you're next.
Paul.
And for something, forgive me, being a bit more basic. I'm interested in the use of the term nature. I saw a program the other night by Brian Cox on the universe, and his summary was about the wonders of nature and what nature does. And of course, that the Romantic movement has been propagating that for 200 years, and leading from Wordsworth to people like Paley. And of course, it's with Darwinism. Have we got a dualism here?
How so? What do you mean?
In other words, we have God and we have nature as a dual system. And in many ways, we've elevated nature to being either a replacement for God or a yin and yang system. We've got God and we've got nature. Yeah.
Well, Brian Cox, I doubt he would want to be called a dualist.
No, he wouldn't. But I would say that he often uses nature in a very theological way.
Yeah,
I wonder whether we, or often theology as a response, has been looking with the concept of nature by producing a dualism.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I never thought too deep into this question, but if you ask me, and again, just full disclosure, all cards on the table, I am a Thomist. So in that sense, I am a dualist. There is God and nature is not God. Creation is not God. And I don't see a problem there. I remember when writing my doctorate once, I was very keen on dismissing occasionalism. And my supervisor said, well, you have to show me why. What's wrong with occasionalism? In the sense that, and then I had to think quite hard on that. and then I found a few reasons why I didn't like it. But why shouldn't we be dualists, I gather? What's the problem with being dualists in theology? I mean,
I don't have a problem with being dualist. Actually,
right.
I'm a biologist who then did theology,
Yeah.
although very much as a working minister. It's the equivalence.
All right, I understand now. So whether by putting so much stress in Brian Cox, for instance,
Yes, yes,
so much stress on nature, he's creating a God out of nature.
yes, and
Oh
we
yeah,
yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, but we
In
in
that sense,
response are looking at that created God in our theology and looking at it as an equivalence. In other words, this
yeah,
dualism is of two equivalent centers,
yeah,
human beings, because people like Brian Cox and Wordsworth certainly personified nature in many ways in their expressions.
yeah. Well, I guess, I mean, he comes, well, I've never read, or I don't know if he even wrote anything too profound in these matters, but I guess he has that same intuition that Einstein had, you know.
Yeah,
You ask me about God, well, I like the Spinoza God, right? So I don't know how much.
he uses nature very much in that way. I don't think he uses God, but he
Yeah.
has been sympathetic to, yeah, I think he's been to some Greenbelt and various other Christian meetings and talked
Oh,
about it.
yeah,
But
yeah.
so that when we're looking at the whole way we're looking at nature and God, because of the Romantic movement, has
Yeah.
become an equivalence. We got two gods.
Nature. Yeah. Well, I guess so. Yeah, in that sense, yes. Um,
And how
I,
far away is
I
that
think,
from the
yeah,
Judaic and you know, and indeed the Islamic concept of God?
yeah. Well, yeah. So nature and God. And I think it will all. So again, I never met Brian Cox, and I never heard him speaking about God too directly. But I gather if you ask him, he would go with Spinoza's Deus sive natura, right? That would be my yeah.
And the other question I got, which was not related, is inductive and deductive reasoning on very basic on causality. That our knowledge of causality is always limited.
Yes. And what's the question? I mean, up to there,
Well, it's really to say,
yeah.
that we can never 100% say that something is caused by something else.
No, absolutely. Yeah. But I think that the key point, at least that I was trying to make, is that, or is whether, a theological debate on divine action has to decide, or a model, a construction of how God acts in the world, has to decide whether there is or there is not natural causality. Right? It doesn't matter which cause causes what in nature, as long as you tell me, well, there are natural causes. Can I know it? Not so sure. We can be inductively sure. Yeah. But are there natural causes? Yeah, there are natural causes. Okay. And from there we move forwards, right? Yeah. I think my answer would go into that direction. And if you tell me there are no natural causes, well, then you have occasionalism, whichever kind you want. The more extreme kind, which is the Islamic Kalam, or the less extreme kind, which is Sam Clark and Miley Branch, if you want.
I suppose my question.
I say that Miley Branch is not that extreme.
Yes.
I mean, it's pretty extreme.
But my question, I suppose, comes from practical science. My doctorate was on air pollution and sulfur dioxide, and actually dealing with industry, who argued that you couldn't prove causality, therefore it didn't happen. And you had to say, well, it is the most likely cause. And of course, whenever we've just with climate change, all these debates work through that basis, that the argument is you haven't proven it. Well, you can't in science. You can never prove it. You can only show it's the most likely explanation.
Yeah. Thank you, Hume. I guess.
Yeah, quite.
Brilliant. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks.
Mark, you've got your hand up. Thank you, and thank you for waiting.
Sure. Ignacio, thanks so much for that. Really helpful. I think this is going to be a bit of a technical question, but it goes back to something that Andrew was asking earlier on, and it concerns, God as the kind of boundary condition of the universe, which I think, in my reading of Peacocke, and I've been puzzling with this material for a long time. It's very, very difficult. The question for me is the degree to which Peacocke is speaking metaphorically. Right. Now, once you start saying that Peacocke's discussion of natural causes and God is like this or that or the other in science, once you say this is just a metaphor, then the question of God's divine causes being a natural cause just drops out. I mean, it's just not really relevant. We're not talking about God's cause amongst causes. So but my thinking goes a bit like this. Okay, so what are the sort of boundary conditions that Peacocke has in mind? And I suppose the most important one I can think of is something like the speed of light. So the speed of light in a vacuum is, what is it? Something like 300,000 kilometers per second. So that's like a very, very important boundary condition for the physical universe as we know it. Now, if we had Arthur here alive today and you said to him, so is God the speed of light? Of course, he would say, no, of course not. So that must be, but he probably, I imagine he would say, I'm speaking metaphorically. God puts limits on nature. It's as though we're talking of the speed of light in a vacuum. So, and if that's the case, then a lot of what he's saying here is actually just, he's kind of playing with metaphors. And so, the worries about whether this is an interventionist view or not an interventionist view actually are less relevant. So that's my kind of, my question in a way. Am I right or am I wrong? I said, what do you think?
Yeah. So, again, this question brings me to John Polkinghorne, actually, as well, because I studied them quite in parallel. So unfortunately, I never met Arthur as to have a conversation and get a sense of what his writing was on this. And as I did have an opportunity to talk to John or to Bob Russell and others, but if you tell me that he would have said that when he spoke about the boundary of being and the existential boundary of the universe, he was talking metaphorically, I would say, well, it's not how I read it. I will need to reread him under that lens. Because in his Theology for a Scientific Age, or in the papers he published, in this the big volumes on scientific perspectives on divine action and all that, he's quite straightforward. And why do I say this? John Polkinghorne, right? He changed his views on divine action, right? So first, he had a very strong view on information input, active information input, without energy exchange, because he didn't want to break any physical laws or principles. But then he read Moltmann and he went to the kenotic view, right? And he said, well, God can act as another cause, and therefore there could be energetic input as well. And then when you told him, well, but that's God acting as a cause among causes, which is the Thomist kind of strategy, John would have said, well, that's fine, no problem. I don't care, because of God's kenosis, right? And then there's a third stage, I think, in John, in which he started speaking metaphorically, but explicitly. He said all these were language games in which we tried to understand what is unconceivable, right? This is the final stage in Paul Kant. I did not find that kind of movement in Peacocke. And in that sense is that I would have to go again and read it again with that lens. Now, when you spoke about the speed of light as a boundary, I never thought of it. You know, coming as a philosopher, you were a scientist before, so you have those examples in mind. As a philosopher, when he says the boundary of being, I just jump metaphysical thinking, you know. So I think of through those words as, yeah, you know, there is being and there is non-being, and God is beyond being, and in that sense, I imagine, or I try to picture God as the boundary of being, not as a physical limit that could be the speed of light, or I don't know, what's pure zero, like Kelvin zero in temperature.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. We're talking about the difference between physics and metaphysics here, aren't we? So, which is a really significant point about what is Peacocke doing? Is he talking in physics terms or metaphysics terms? Yeah, I'll need to get back to the text as well, because I always read him as, I thought he was talking about physics and using it as a metaphor. Right. Okay. No. Yeah. No. Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful.
Yeah. By the way, if I may, very simple. I love that poster in the back of your office, the Divine Action Conference.
I'm sure you recognize it. Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mark, for your question. And it's just gone forward, so we are going to have to, unfortunately, finish this conversation. This is one of those points where I think if we were in person, there would be a very long conversation over coffee with Ignacio. Ignacio, I don't know if you have to leave. If you don't, and people want to have a chat, then I'm sure we can facilitate that in here. We've certainly still got a lot of questions, comments, thoughts in the chat as well. So do take a chance to have a look at those. But I think what it just really highlights is how challenging this conversation is, and a lot of how many assumptions we're all making in reading what other people have written, which is part of the challenge, right? So are people being metaphorical? Is that the only way we can discuss this? Are they being realist? So I think thank you ever so much